Good day, students. Professor Matt here. Today's lecture is on the technique of sound in film. Now, movies were never really silent. Even in the silent era, there was sounds and music that accompanied most features, especially in major metropolitan areas. There'd be an orchestral pit where musicians would play music to accompany the film, and sometimes there was a person who would act as a narrator, perhaps reading the intertitles or providing other expository pieces of information. And some films like The Birth of a Nation, in fact had its own score that would circulate along with the prints of the film. Now, silent films were strange in the sense that they separated the actors' speech from their bodies via the intertitles. And so in this sense, the development of sound film was a natural phenomenon because it relates more to the semblance of reality or verisimilitude. Now, the Warner Brothers pioneered the Vitaphone system, which was an early synchronized sound system that was a sound-on-disc system, adopted after the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927. The Warner Brothers took a big gamble on sound film. They were a small family-run studio trying to make a break into the big leagues, and they figured that the sound technology was the best way that they were going to do that. And they succeeded. Now, the sound-on-disc system was a clumsy sort of system because you had two devices that were operating, so it was easier to get out of synchronization, and the discs were fragile, so they could sometimes break, and thereby leaving you with a reel of film that didn't have sound. So eventually, the sound-on-film, or the optical soundtrack, would replace the sound-on-disc system. Now, in the 1920s, a group of exhibitors, Lowe's, Universal, First National, Paramount, and Producers Distribution Corporation, signed what was called the Big Five Agreement. And essentially, this was a power play by some of the biggest players in Hollywood. Lowe's, of course, owned MGM. Universal, First National, was a large theater chain that had a distribution production facility as well. And of course, Paramount being the largest. And Cecil B. DeMille's Producers Distributing Corporation, which wasn't a very large company but had a lot of prestige. They were trying to agree to adopt the same sound technology so that they could standardize the use of the medium and not harm profits too badly. Now, it's estimated that by 1929, 75% of Hollywood films were sound films. So this shows just how quickly this transformation took place, from the release of the first film in late 1927 into the transitional period in 1928, and by 1929 into 30, it had nearly been complete. And of course the sound systems changed as well. Now, these early talkies, they were called talkies because essentially what viewers said is that they were just watching pictures of people talking. It was sort of one step forward in the sense of sound technology, but also a few steps back in terms of the other elements of film, such as mise-en-scène, cinematography, and editing, because of the constraints of the new sound technology. So in the late silent era, films had displayed a remarkable sense of artistry in terms of their mise-en-scène, cinematography, and editing, but all this came to a screeching halt when sound came on the picture. So no longer could filmmakers shoot multiple films in the same studio, but the new injunction of quiet on the set came into effect. Now, another problem was that the camera made a whirring sound that was picked up on the microphone. And so cameras then had to be put in these soundproof boxes, which really restricted the cinematography as well as the editing. One cinematographer said that films in this transitional period have a mushy look because the camera had to film through a pane of glass. Now, the boxes were very uncomfortable, they were small, they lacked oxygen, and they were really hot, so the cinematographers and directors hated being in the boxes as well. And of course, the other problem was that at this point, sound could only be recorded from one microphone that had to be hidden in a prop. So you'd get characters kind of standing around talking into a prop. And so many filmmakers and directors bemoaned the end of cinema. They felt that, artistically speaking, the talkies were garbage, and that eventually it would be a fad that would play itself out, and filmmakers would go back to silent films. Of course, during this time, synchronization was really what dominated the global demand. The public was entranced by the novelty of talking pictures, and they would go simply just to watch people talk, regardless of the story or the other cinematic devices. Now, one quote from a film critic at the time said, the public was fascinated by the novelty, wanting to be sure that they were hearing what they saw. and they would have felt that a trick was being played on them if they were not shown the words coming from the lips of the actors. And so the 30s became a time of experiment in terms of sound technology. Hollywood was able to ride the wave of novelty for a few years, but eventually that wore off, and people were tired of the talkies, and they wanted films with more artistic integrity. And so that forced new developments in sound technology. Things like unidirectional mics, post-synchronized sound, as well as the boom mic, was also really instrumental in aiding the facility of that technology. And eventually, filmmakers were liberated from the notion that everything seen on the screen had to be heard on the soundtrack. Now, there's a couple of films that serve as key milestones or watershed marks in the development of sound, one of those being Citizen Kane in 1941. Of course, Orson Welles came from a radio background, so he was well equipped to deal with the acoustics of sound on film. And many film historians and critics consider Citizen Kane the first three-dimensional sound film because of its wonderful display of sound perspective. The second major milestone came in 1977 with the release of Star Wars, which ushered in a new era of sound film, the multi-track and Dolby noise reduction system, which presented an unprecedented quality and definition. Now, these technical advances in sound recording, like the Dolby system, diminish essentially the noise of the system. If you watch a lot of early 1930s films, you'll hear the static of the system being picked up. And of course, as technology will progress, we'll eliminate that static noise, which conceals, in a sense, the apparatus and reduces the distance between the object perceived and its representation. So, in other words, the goal of sound technology is to eliminate noise that interferes with the transmission of meaningful sound. Sound in the modern film. Now, films create impressions that people and things on screen produce appropriate noise, and the soundtrack is actually something that's produced separately and manipulated for effect. So sound is more difficult to analyze than some of our other elements of film because of a variety of reasons. One, we're generally accustomed to ignoring many sounds in our environment. If you have small children, you might feel this profoundly. It's also true that you can't pause a film and analyze it the same way you can pause a film and analyze its mise-en-scène, its cinematography, and editing. But regardless, we can classify sound according to three basic elements. First being the sound effects or the noise, secondly the dialogue, and third the musical score. Now all these things add layers of meaning and provide sensory and emotional stimuli, as well as direct the attention of the audience. The dialogue. Now the dialogue attracts, of course, the majority of the viewer's attention. It's what we pay most attention to when watching a film. It shows or reveals character, it pushes the plot forward, and overlapping dialogue is a particular technique that can be used for either thematic or aesthetic effect. Citizen Kane uses it a lot, Orson Welles in Citizen Kane. Screwball comedies of the 1930s and early 1940s use overlapping dialogue frequently, as well as the films of Robert Altman, an auteur in the 1970s, famous for a variety of films, among them MASH. Now dialogue, a few other terms. Voice-off is when an audience hears the voice of a character that's not visible on the screen, but has been established in the diegesis by means of a previous shot or other context. So the diegesis is the film world. So we know the character is on there, we're just not seeing them on the screen when we hear their voice. Visible sound is sounds that naturally and realistically emanate from the images on the screen, whereas invisible sounds come from a source that's not visible. So voice-off is an example of invisible sound. But invisible sound is a broader category that would encompass other noises, like a door being shut that we don't see, or a gun firing that we don't see on the screen. Now, off-screen is an ironic term because we're speaking of the acoustic as if it were visual. So it's not the noise per se that's off-screen, but it's the image making the noise that is. And so it shows that we sort of primarily privilege the visual over the acoustic. Points of view and sound. Now, a filmmaker may alternate between an objective and a subjective point of view in terms of sound and use shots to delineate that shift. So, for example, an objective point of view shot may contain actual sounds in the environment. The filmmaker might cut to a subjective point of view or an indirect subjective point of view shot that will show sound as an extension of a character's internal reaction. So the subjective or indirect subjective shot might intensify or isolate one particular sound in that environment. That can also be called expressionism because what we have is an external representation of a character's internal state. Sound perspective is the idea that the closer to the camera is to the source of the object making the sound, the louder the sound will be, and conversely, the further away it is, the quieter it will be. Now, this seems natural to us today. However, this is something that really started to develop after Citizen Kane and the use of sound perspective in 1941. The difference between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. Diegetic sound occurs in the story world. It's in the diegesis. Non-diegetic sound comes from a source outside of the diegesis. So that would be the score. We know that the characters do not hear the musical score. That's something that's for the audience. It could also be, another example would be an omniscient non-participant narrator. So we hear a voiceover, but it's not associated with the character in the story. Instead, it would be more of a godlike figure. Other uses of sound. Loudness refers to its volume. Pitch refers to the frequency, which could be high or low. And then ambient sounds are natural sounds to the environment and help the filmmakers create verisimilitude, or a semblance of reality. Sound can also be used as a transitional device to link one scene to the next. Two examples. One is a sound bridge, where the sound from a previous shot lingers while we see the images of the next shot, or it might work the other way around. We hear the sound from the shot coming up while the previous shot still is on the screen. The second type is a dialogue hook. In a dialogue hook, a line of dialogue is completed but anticipates the next shot. So for example, one character might say, "Have you eaten lunch yet?" And then we get an abrupt cut to two characters seated at a table having lunch. Voiceover narration is when we hear a human voice off-screen. Voiceover narration is when we hear a human voice off-screen, and it usually conveys expository information. Now, it could be an omniscient, sort of godlike voice, or it could be limited to a particular character, or it could be an actual character in the story. Now, dead track is the complete absence of sound, which ironically can be one of the most powerful uses of sound. The musical score. Music is largely about rhythm, and film has similar patterns in pacing of the plot, the pattern of speech and dialogue, and the editing of various shots. The musical score is intended for the audience, so it's intended to highlight the audience's emotional reaction to what they see up on the screen. It adds emotional material that might be unable to be conveyed by visual means, and part of the ideology of the musical score, at least in Hollywood cinema, is that the viewer should not consciously think about the score. So it should be something that passes by us, but yet simultaneously works on us subconsciously. And one way to test this out is to watch, next time you're watching a film with someone, at the end say, what did you think of the score? And they're likely to have no idea what you're talking about. The score can start diegetically and then move to non-diegetic. So for an example, you might have a character who plays a song or sings a song or listens to a song on the radio, and then later that song might appear as part of the score. Casablanca does this with the song As Time Goes By. Sam the Piano Man plays the song, and then later in the film we hear the song on the score. The film score can also be divided into two types, the first of which is Mickey Mousing, named, of course, after the adorable little cartoon character. In this instance, the music is focused on kinetic movement, so we see the characters acting and physically moving in ways that correspond directly to the rhythms of the music, as was the case in the cartoon. So as you can infer from this, the musical genre utilizes Mickey Mousing quite extensively. Other films might use it in isolated incidents, but certainly it's very important to the musical genre. The other type of film score is a generalized score, which is also known as an implicit score. In this case, the focus is on mood, not matching precisely the actions to the rhythms of the music. Some other special functions of the score would be to heighten the dramatic effect of dialogue. So in some films, filmmakers might not feel like they're getting the right performances from their actors, or they might want to heighten the effect of the dialogue, so they'll add music behind it. Other films that might, for example, feature better writing, will not use music during the dialogue because the filmmakers want you to focus on the dialogue and not be distracted with the music. Another technique is called Peter and the Wolfing, And that's an example where a song is associated with a particular character. The Graduate is a great film for showcasing how songs can be associated with different characters. The score can also provide a sense of time and place. So for example, if you have a historical piece, say set in the 1930s, you can use music from that time to help recreate that era. The score can also foreshadow events, build dramatic tension, or trigger conditioned responses. And these can all be used for economy. For example, there might be songs or music associated with the good guys versus the bad guys. You know in Star Wars that Darth Vader is going to appear on the scene even before you see him because you hear the music that's associated with Vader versus the music that's associated with Luke and the Rebels. Another function of the musical score could be used for traveling music. So in this case you have a character who needs to get from point A to point B, and to do so you have a nifty little montage sequence that is set to some song that sounds akin to traveling. The score can cover for weaknesses in the film. Again, if a director is not getting the performance from an actor in dialogue scenes, then we can add some music, add some score behind that to help heighten the effect. The score could be used ironically. Stanley Kubrick had a penchant for using music ironically. For example, he has a character in Clockwork Orange sing the song Singing in the Rain while he assaults several people. In Dr. Strangelove, we have the Doomsday Machine that drops the atomic bomb on the Earth as we have some happy music playing in the background. The score could also be used expressionistically. So we said expressionism is when we have an external representation of a character's internal state. So that could happen. And the score could be used to correspond to developments in the plot. So the exposition might have one type of music. As we move to the complication, the music changes. At the climax, it might be a different type of music, and then the denouement, there might be yet another type of music. And then occasionally you might have a film whose plot is based entirely around the notion of sound. A couple of examples. Blowout by Brian De Palma is a film about the protagonist is a sound technician working on films, and so he goes out and tries to capture sounds in nature to use in his films. And as a result, he unwittingly stumbles on to a murder and conspiracy plot. Another example is Francis Ford Coppola's film The Conversation, a rather wonderful film he made between The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 in the mid-1970s, starring Gene Hackman, who plays a bugger who gets this conversation. And the further he probes into the nature of this conversation, the more he realizes he stumbled upon a murder and conspiracy. You know, both these films were made in the wake of Watergate. Balancing the score. Hollywood has a long history of elaborate scores with full orchestras. You know, they spend a lot of money on scores, and by contrast, independent films have sometimes worked against that tradition. Sometimes by having no score, and other times maybe a very minimal score. Now, part of that might be finances. It's very expensive to score an entire film with a full orchestra, so the independent film lacking more robust budget might opt for other alternatives. And other times it might be a polemic. For example, the French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard will, on occasion, deconstruct a Hollywood score. For example, he has a film where the score starts very conventionally, and then suddenly the score cuts out right in the middle of a scene. And then a few seconds later it comes back on, and then it increases in intensity to the point where it drowns out the characters' dialogue. You can't hear what the characters are saying. Then the score stops again, then it starts again, and clearly he's monkeying around with a score in an attempt to deconstruct classical Hollywood ideology, which would say that we shouldn't pay any attention to the score. And in Godard's case, we clearly have to pay attention to the score. He's taking this as sort of a Brechtian estrangement. So as opposed to identifying with the emotion or the mood of the piece, instead we are cognitively or intellectually disengaged, and therefore we are afforded some critical distance where we can think about and analyze the ideology of film score. So that covers today's lecture. This is Professor Matt signing off until next time.